Everybody knows about the Ice King. Everybody knows about the Mushroom War and the businessmen in the iceberg and Marceline's 1,000 years and the letter Simon Petrikov wrote before he lost the words to write it. That story has been told, and told well. And if you have spent any time at all in the land of Oo, you already carry it somewhere in your chest without needing to be reminded. Tonight we are not telling that story. Tonight we are going somewhere stranger, into the rooms of this show that most people walk past without noticing there was a door there at all. The obscure lore. The stuff buried 2 and 3 episodes deep in a season nobody rewatches. The background detail that only means something once you know what it's attached to. The quiet reveal in a special or a spin-off that recontextualizes something you thought you already understood. This is the land of Oo, from the side nobody photographs. The part of the map that never made it onto a poster or a t-shirt. The corners where the show quietly kept its stranger, sadder secrets, while everyone's attention stayed fixed on the boy and his dog out front. Get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let this run in the background the way it's meant to. We have a long way to go tonight, and none of it is urgent. There is a family in the Candy Kingdom that almost nobody talks about, and the reason nobody talks about it is that for most of the show's run, it barely seemed to exist. Princess Bubblegum had a great uncle. His name was Gumbald. He was mentioned once, briefly, in a second season episode as a minor historical detail, someone who had cut down an entire grove of taffy trees in a single night. A strange little fact dropped into a conversation and never followed up on. For years, that was all he was, a throwaway line. Something that sounded like a placeholder from an earlier version of the show's mythology, back before anyone had decided that Bubblegum's origin would be stranger and sadder than a normal family tree. And then, in the 9th season, in an episode simply titled Bonnabelle Bubblegum, the show went back and answered a question that most viewers hadn't even thought to ask. How does a woman who was grown from a hive mind of pink biomass end up with an uncle at all? The answer is one of the loneliest things Adventure Time ever built, and it is easy to miss precisely because it is delivered as backstory rather than as a headline event. Roughly 800 years before the main events of the series, this is a number the show gives directly, not a guess. A very young Bonnabelle Bubblegum was living in the post-apocalyptic wasteland that would eventually become the Candy Kingdom, in a hideout beside a radioactive river, with only her infant brother, Nettie, for company. She had already emerged from the mother gum. She had already ensured her brother's safety, and what she wanted, more than safety, more than shelter, was family, not followers, not subjects. Family, in the ordinary, aching sense of the word. People who existed because you loved them and wanted them near you, not because you needed them to serve a function. So she built some, using large pieces of gum and a device that could give them life. Bonnabelle created 3 relatives from scratch. An elder woman she named Aunt Lolly, a tall young man she called Cousin Chickle, and an older man she named Uncle Gumbald. She assigned them roles the way a lonely child assigns roles to imaginary friends, except these friends could talk back and act and want things of their own. For a while it worked. They built a small candy town together and planted taffy trees, and by every account the show gives us, it was a genuinely happy period, maybe the only stretch of unclouded happiness in the entire 800-year span of Bonnabelle Bubblegum's life. It did not last. Gumbald began to want more than the life his niece had designed for him. He cut down the taffy trees she loved to build himself a cabin, and told her, plainly, that he intended to build a candy city of his own, with himself in charge of it. When Bonnie stopped him by flooding the site he wanted with what would become Lake Butterscotch, Gumbald's resentment curdled into something colder. He created a devoted, dim-witted boyfriend named Mr. Cream Puff to distract his niece and keep her occupied while he, Lolly, and Chickle plotted to remove her. He developed a serum the show calls it Dum Dum Juice, designed to turn Bonnibel into something docile and simple, something that would stop asking questions and stop standing in his way. He tested it on Lolly and Chickle first, tricking them into eating cupcakes laced with the formula, transforming his own co-conspirators into cheerful, simple-minded candy creatures without their consent, purely as a demonstration of what he intended to do to Bonnie herself. When Bonnie returned from her date and Gumbald came at her with the same serum, she fought back, shattering the container in self-defense, and the liquid splashed across his own face instead. Gumbald became a large glass bowl of fruit punch, a punch bowl, cheerful and glassy-eyed, utterly stripped of the ambition that had driven him a moment before. And here is the detail that the show trusts you to sit with rather than explaining outright. Bonnibel looked at what she had done, looked at her transformed family members dancing around her in their new, harmless, amnesiac joy, and decided that the simplicity, the compliance, the total absence of resistance was better. She told them to call her Princess, not aunt, not niece, not family, Princess. And from that day forward, every single candy person she created afterward, the entire population of the kingdom she would go on to rule for the better part of a millennium, was designed from the outset to be simple-minded, obedient, and incapable of doing what Gumbald had tried to do. The reviewer Katie Burt, writing about the episode for the entertainment site Den of Geek, noted that this reveal recontextualizes the entire Candy Kingdom's social structure, that Bubblegum's rule over cheerful, docile citizens isn't simply a stylistic choice for a children's show. It's the direct, traceable consequence of a childhood betrayal she never fully processed. Think about what that means for every episode of the show you have already watched. Every candy person who explodes into panic at the slightest threat, every citizen who trusts Princess Bubblegum's judgment without question, every subject who has never once tried to seize her throne, all of it traces back to a single night 800 years ago, when the only family she had built with her own hands turned on her, and she decided, in the aftermath, that love was too dangerous to risk twice. She built a kingdom instead of grieving. And this is the part the show never says out loud, but plants everywhere, if you know to look for it. She built the kingdom's entire emotional architecture around never being betrayed like that again. Every citizen of the Candy Kingdom lives inside the shape of Bonnibel Bubblegum's oldest wound, and none of them know it. If you want to sit with where and when you're watching this, go ahead and drop it in the comments what time it is where you are, what the room looks like. Whether you're already half asleep, it helps to know who else is out here in the dark with the Land of Ooh playing quietly in their ears. Now let's keep going, because Gumbald's story isn't actually over, and neither is the punishment nobody quite calls a punishment. Gumbald did not stay a punch bowl forever. He returned in the mini-series Elements, restored to his original form along with Lolly and Chickle by a wave of anti-elemental magic unleashed by Lumpy Space Princess, a genuinely strange plot mechanism that the show treats with total seriousness, since Lumpy Space Princess's lumps turn out to carry a kind of neutralizing, reality-correcting power that nobody had previously suspected she possessed. Once restored, Gumbald did not come back grateful. He came back with 800 years of resentment intact and nowhere to put it except at the niece who had turned him into furniture. He built a rival city-state, Gumbaldia, gathered nearly every villain Finn and Jake had ever defeated across the entire run of the show, and prepared for outright war against the Candy Kingdom, what the show's own timeline material refers to plainly as the Gum War. It is worth pausing on how strange this is as a piece of storytelling. A single throwaway line from Season 2 about some taffy trees getting cut down eventually detonates into a full-scale war involving the accumulated villain roster of nearly a decade of episodes. That is not filler. That is patience. The kind of patience only a show that trusted its own long memory could afford. The war very nearly happened. Finn, uncomfortable with the idea of two people he cared about trying to destroy each other, used Jake's nightmare-inducing nightmare juice to trap himself, Fern, Gumbald, and Bubblegum together in a shared dream, forcing a reckoning none of them could avoid. Inside that dream, Finn and Fern confronted the literal grass demon, controlling Fern's body, a piece of lore we will come back to later, because Fern's story doesn't end where most people think it does. When everyone woke, Bubblegum offered her uncle forgiveness and proposed calling off the war entirely. Gumbald, characteristically, tried to betray her one last time, reaching for the dum-dum juice again, and this time it was Lolly, the ant he had once poisoned without asking, who stopped him, tripping him so that the serum splashed onto his own face a second time, reverting him permanently to the punch bowl. Lolly made peace with Bubblegum. The two of them agreed to share rule. And Gumbald, the man who wanted a kingdom of his own more than he wanted the family that made him, ended the show's run exactly where he began, a glass bowl of fruit punch, seen in the final montage of the series, enjoying a quiet toast at the Candy Tavern, with a handful of minor Candy Kingdom regulars. No fanfare. No final confrontation. Just a bowl of punch. At a bar, being poured drinks by people who have no idea what he almost cost them. There's something almost unbearably calm about that ending, once you know the whole shape of the story leading up to it. This is a character who orchestrated an entire war and came within one tripped foot of executing a coup 2 separate times across 8 centuries. And his final scene in the show is just sitting quietly among friends, harmless, transformed, forgotten by nearly everyone except the people who actually lived through what he did. Adventure Time rarely punishes its villains with anything resembling drama. It tends to let them dissolve into something smaller and stranger than the threat they once posed. And Gumbald's Fate comic, on its surface, genuinely unsettling underneath, is one of the clearest examples of that pattern in the entire series. Now go a layer deeper, into the part of the Candy Kingdom that Princess Bubblegum built, specifically so she would never have to look at it directly. Everyone remembers Peppermint Butler as comic relief, a small, courteous mint who serves tea, drives the princess around, occasionally gets flustered. What almost nobody sits with long enough to feel uncomfortable is exactly how much darkness the show quietly attaches to him, episode after episode, always in the register of a joke, never in the register of a threat, which is precisely why it works. In the episode, Mortal Recoil, he is the one who realizes Princess Bubblegum has been possessed by the Lich, sensing it the way an animal senses a predator, hissing involuntarily at something the rest of the room can't see. In Return to the Nightosphere, a background photograph shows him serving as a caddy, while Marceline's demonic father, Hunson Abadir, plays a round of golf. A single, unexplained image that quietly confirms Peppermint Butler has a standing, casual relationship with the ruler of the Nightosphere, the show's version of a realm devoted to the corruption and consumption of souls. In the episode, The Suitor, he summons an actual demon into Cinnamon Bun without so much as raising his voice. And it's here that the show gives us the detail that reframes everything else. The Gumball Guardians, the enormous stone sentinels who guard the Candy Kingdom's most sensitive secrets, refer to Peppermint Butler by a specific title. They call him Dark One. Not butler, not servant. Dark One, a name that implies an institutional relationship, a recognized role within the kingdom's actual power structure, something closer to a court sorcerer or a state-sanctioned exorcist than a member of the household staff. This is confirmed and deepened in the episode Nemesis, where a vigilante named Peacemaster, a Puritangent-styled zealot devoted to eliminating dark magic wherever he finds it, hunts Peppermint Butler, specifically because of his connections to the Nightosphere and his command of forbidden magic. During their confrontation, Peppermint Butler summons a suit of spiritual armor and a flaming sword out of nothing, bends space to relocate instantly across the battlefield, and, when finally cornered, retaliates by transforming two of Peacemaster's own children into demon hybrids, a genuinely disturbing escalation for a character the show has spent years coding as harmless comic relief. He wins the fight. Peacemaster, humiliated and outmatched, is forced to abandon his magical arsenal entirely and walk away. What makes this material properly obscure rather than simply dark is how little the show ever explains it. We are never told in plain terms what Peppermint Butler actually is, what his arrangement with the Nightosphere entails, or what exactly the Candy Kingdom's leadership knows about the man serving their tea. The show's own encyclopedia material and companion writing gestures toward him having connections to something like a hermetic magical order, but even that is left at the level of implication rather than confirmed canon. Princess Bubblegum, brilliant and paranoid in equal measure, clearly relies on him for the kind of protection she cannot provide through science or diplomacy, the kind of protection that requires someone willing to deal with demons, summon spirits, and know things that shouldn't be knowable. And Peppermint Butler, for his part, seems entirely at peace with being both cheerful in one register and genuinely dangerous in another, without any apparent friction between the two. There is a phrase worth sitting with here. The show is content to let some rooms be known by their outline rather than their contents. Peppermint Butler is one of the largest rooms in Adventure Time that the show never fully opens, and the choice to leave it shut is, itself, a kind of storytelling, trusting you to feel the shape of something without demanding it be explained to you in full. Now we go further down, past the Candy Kingdom entirely, toward the character who was supposed to be the show's original hero, and who instead became one of its quietest tragedies. His name was Billy. In the early seasons, Finn and Jake idolize him the way children idolize a legend they've only heard about secondhand, a warrior who rescued princesses, slew an evil ocean, defeated a giant bear, and, most importantly, was the one who originally defeated the Lich and sealed him away in amber 1,000 years earlier. When Finn and Jake finally meet him in the episode His Hero, Billy is old, tired, and no longer believes that violence solves anything. He tells them, with the weariness of someone who has fought the same battle too many times to feel triumphant about winning it, that the people he saves are never actually safe because evil simply reconstitutes itself and comes back. He has developed In the show's own phrasing, a literal void in his heart, not a metaphor exactly, but close to one, a hollowness produced by decades of heroism that never resolved anything at the scale he wanted it to. Finn and Jake's friendship, ironically, briefly restores his faith in the old ways. It's a warm episode. It feels, on first viewing, like a complete story. It is not complete. Years later, when the Lich returns in the fourth season episode, simply titled The Lich, the ancient entity, old, patient, and no longer contained by amber tracks down Billy specifically. Exploiting his age and his long retirement from real combat, and kills him. Not off screen, not implied. The show shows you the aftermath directly. The Lich wearing Billy's corpse as a disguise, using the dead hero's own reputation and trustworthiness to manipulate Finn into helping him. Finn, who has spent years believing Billy to be the greatest hero who ever lived, unknowingly hands the Enchiridion an ancient, reality-tearing artifact to a bear working on the Lich's behalf, setting off a chain of events that nearly ends in the Lich, opening a portal to the wider multiverse, and wishing for the extinction of all life. Billy's death is confirmed explicitly, twice, later in the show once by Prismo in Finn the Human, and again in the aptly named Billy's Bucket List. His actual remains are destroyed by the Lich not long after. There is no funeral. There is no tribute episode. The greatest hero who ever produced dies off camera, is puppeteered by the thing he spent his whole life fighting, and is quietly discarded once he's no longer useful, and the show never asks you to grieve him with anything more than the fact of it, stated plainly and moved past. What makes this genuinely unsettling, once you sit with it rather than just watching it happen, is what it implies about heroism itself within the show's own cosmology. Billy did everything right. By every measure the land of O has for measuring heroism, he was strong, he was righteous. He won the fight that mattered most against the most ancient evil in the show's mythology, and he won it decisively enough to imprison the Lich for 1,000 years, and none of it protected him. Old age and a body that could no longer fight made him exactly as vulnerable as anyone else, and the specific manner of his death, used as a costume, worn like a skin suit to manipulate the next generation of heroes, is one of the bleakest images Adventure Time ever produced, delivered with almost no fanfare, tucked into the middle of a season that has plenty of other things going on. It is worth remembering because it recontextualizes something Finn says much later in the show, when he is older and has lost his own arm and buried his own losses. Heroism, in this world, does not come with a retirement plan. It comes with a shelf life, and when that shelf life ends, the world does not slow down to notice. The Enchiridion itself deserves a moment of its own attention, because its origin is stranger and sadder than most viewers realize. The book was discovered before the Mushroom War by none other than Simon Petrikov and his fiancée, Betty Groff, found together somewhere in the Hindu Kush mountain range, in what the show implies is Simon's professional life as an antiquarian. Betty's role in locating it was deliberately kept out of the public record, not because the show forgot to mention her, but because, within the story's own logic, she wanted Simon to receive full credit so that the scientific community that had looked down on him would finally take him seriously. He presented the book to a museum. It survived the war that ended everything else he knew, passed through unknown hands for centuries, and eventually ended up guarded at Mount Cragdor by a small keeper named Keeper and a minotaur named Manish Man, waiting 1,000 years for Finn to pass a series of trials and claim it as his own. There is something almost too neat about the fact that the artifact which nearly ends the world in Finn's era was found, originally, by the same broken man who would go on to nearly lose himself to another magical object entirely. Two ancient, reality altering artifacts, two discoveries made in the years just before the world ended, two separate men who could not fully anticipate what they had actually found. The show never draws a direct line between these two facts. It simply leaves them sitting near each other, the way ruins sit near each other, in a landscape that grew over its own history without bothering to clear the ground first. There's a whole society tucked inside this show that most viewers absorb only as background texture, and it's worth actually looking at directly for a moment because it reveals something a little uncomfortable about who gets to hold power in the land of Oo and how casually that power gets handed out. Wizards, in this world, are not simply gifted individuals who happen to study magic. They are, functionally, a recognized social class with their own city, their own police force, their own rules of conduct. And this is the detail that tends to get lost in the show's comic framing of it, their own deeply unequal treatment of who is allowed to participate in their institutions at all. In the episode Wizard Battle, an entire tournament is staged specifically for wizards to compete for a valuable prize, and the show reveals, almost as a passing gag, that female wizards attempting to enter the competition are turned away outright or transformed into cats as punishment for refusing to kiss Princess Bubblegum, who is serving, in this instance, as the tournament's judge on the mouth as a condition of entry. Huntress Wizard is the sole woman who manages to compete regardless, and the show never quite clarifies whether she found some loophole around the requirement or simply refused it and was allowed to proceed anyway. Either way, the detail sits there, undiscussed by any character in the episode, treated as background color rather than injustice, which is precisely the kind of thing this show tends to do when it wants you to notice something without being told outright that you're supposed to be bothered by it. Beyond the tournament itself, an entire settlement called Wizard City exists, governed by its own magical police force, the Wizard Police, who enforce rules about who is permitted to practice magic and how. Getting expelled from Wizard City, as happens to certain characters across the show's run, functions as something close to a professional disbarment, a loss of standing within an entire recognized institution, not simply a personal setback. And running underneath the entire wizarding world is a specific magical sense the show calls wizard eyes, a heightened form of perception that allows a trained practitioner to detect hidden magic, read auras, and see supernatural detail invisible to ordinary sight. The same underlying ability, differently named and differently sourced, that gives Huntress Wizard her own parallel, Huntress Vision, letting her perceive concealed magic and slow down her perception of fast-moving danger. It's a small piece of connective tissue between two characters who otherwise seem to belong to entirely different corners of the show's mythology. One, an urbane, institutional wizard culture with rules and hierarchies and citywide governance. The other, a lone, forest-dwelling huntress who was raised by adoptive parents and never formally trained in any of it, and the show never states outright that these two systems of perception share a common root. It simply lets you notice, if you're paying attention across enough scattered episodes, that magic in this world seems to organize itself around a small handful of recurring senses and structures, regardless of who ends up wielding them or how formally they were taught. Before we climb any higher, There's a discovery buried in the second season that changes how you have to read every human character introduced afterward, and it rarely gets discussed with the weight it deserves, probably because the episode that introduces it plays almost entirely as slapstick. Finn spends the early seasons of the show believing, without much evidence either way, that he might be the only human being left in the land of Oo. Then, in the episode Susan Strong, he and Jake discover a hidden underground settlement of tall, quiet, tribal figures who wear elaborate animal costumes, live by torchlight beneath the surface, and communicate in short, halting bursts of half-formed language. Finn is thrilled. He assumes, immediately and without hesitation, that he has finally found others like him. He teaches Susan Strong, the member of the tribe who becomes closest to him, small pieces of English, brings her up to the surface, introduces her to the Candy Kingdom's abundance of sweets, and watches her respond to that abundance with a hunger that borders on manic. She tries to eat the buildings, the ground, nearly the candy people themselves, because in her world, nothing has ever looked this soft, this bright, this apparently edible all at once. The scene that recontextualizes everything happens almost by accident. Finn and Jake, trying to scare off the rest of Susan's tribe as they threaten to devour the Candy Kingdom's citizens, use candlelight to project spooky shadows, a trick that should work on ordinary people, and does, for a moment, work until the tribe's younger members, overconfident and unafraid, charge straight through the shadow trick and are accidentally set on fire in the resulting chaos. And when the flaming hats they'd been wearing burn away, what's revealed underneath isn't skin, it's gills, fins. The unmistakable, unsettling evidence that these are not simply humans who happen to dress strangely, they are humans who have been altered, mutated by generations of exposure to whatever the Mushroom War actually did to the biology of everything it touched. Finn's reaction is not triumphant discovery. It's a kind of quiet horror. He looks at Susan and asks her, directly, if she's really human, and rather than answering him, she runs, confused and frightened by a question she may not have the language or the desire to try answering. Jake's response to Finn's shaken silence afterward is one of the more quietly philosophical lines the show ever gave him, delivered without any particular weight in the moment. We're all wild animals, brother. It's a throwaway comfort in the scene itself, and it becomes something closer to a thesis statement once you sit with everything the mutated humans imply about what actually happened to the people who lived through the war that ended the old world. This detail sits in uneasy conversation with what the show reveals much later in the 7th season miniseries Islands. About the other surviving pocket of humanity, Finn eventually finds his own mother's settlement, hidden away on protected islands far from the mainland, defined by caution, isolation, and an almost obsessive commitment to staying separate from the strange, magical, dangerous world the Mushroom War left behind. Two very different human populations, surviving the same catastrophe through two opposite strategies, one group going underground and slowly mutating into something the old world would barely recognize as human at all, and the other retreating to isolated islands, specifically to preserve, as best they could, the exact humanity they were terrified of losing. Neither strategy comes out of the show looking entirely successful. The humans survived by changing so completely that a boy raised entirely by magical dogs still couldn't recognize them as his own kind. Finn's mother's settlement survived by refusing to change at all, and in doing so, produced a community that Finn, after finally reaching it, after years of wondering whether any of his own kind still existed, recognized as safe, functional, and quietly, deeply unfree. It's one of the more understated pieces of thematic architecture in the whole show that survival after a catastrophe large enough might not actually come with a version that lets you stay exactly who you were. You either become something the old world wouldn't recognize, or you build a cage strong enough to protect the version of yourself that refuses to change. And either way, something real gets left behind in the wreckage, regardless of which direction you chose. There's a smaller, sadder detail worth sitting with before we leave the humans behind, and it concerns the guardian creatures that watch over the settlements. The surviving humans eventually built on the islands. Finn visits during islands. These guardians are not gentle sentinels in any traditional sense. They are described and depicted across the miniseries as functioning almost entirely on instinct and threat recognition, mistaking ordinary people for intruders, misreading grief and desperation as hostility, occasionally forcing the very humans they exist to protect into life or death situations, simply because a guardian's understanding of danger was calibrated by whoever built it. Long ago, under conditions nobody left alive fully remembers anymore. Martin Mertens, Finn's father, is nearly killed by one such guardian while fleeing his home island, mistaken for exactly the kind of threat the system was designed to repel, and the confusion nearly costs him his own son's life in the same breath. It's a small piece of world building, easy to miss inside a miniseries already carrying the weight of Finn finally meeting his mother and reckoning with the father who abandoned him. But it quietly reinforces the same idea running underneath the humans, underneath the Candy Kingdom's docile citizens, underneath nearly everything we've walked through tonight, that the systems built to protect the survivors of this world's worst day were assembled in a hurry by frightened, grieving people making their best guess about what safety would require, and that those systems have kept running long after the people who built them are gone, still enforcing rules nobody currently alive actually chose, still occasionally hurting the very people they were built to shelter, simply because nobody with the authority to update them ever got the chance to try. Let's go higher now, off the surface of Ooh entirely, up into the parts of the show's cosmology that exist above kings and princesses and ancient evils, into the actual bureaucracy of the universe. Because Adventure Time, quietly and with almost no fanfare, built out an entire civil service of cosmic beings who manage dreams, death, and the fabric of reality itself, and most of what they do is handled with the tone of overworked office employees rather than gods. Start with the cosmic owl, because he is probably the strangest of all of them, and his real story doesn't surface until years after his first appearance. He shows up early in the show's run as a mysterious presence in what the characters call premonition dreams, dreams that are destined to come true, sometimes benign, sometimes fatal, always signaled by his silent, glowing presence somewhere in the frame. For a long stretch of the show, he is simply an omen, unexplained and a little eerie, the kind of recurring image you register without understanding. Then, gradually, the show reveals that he has an actual interior life. He lives in a cosmic motel. He likes board games. He is, according to the episode, Hoots, genuinely lonely, someone who resents the fact that his mere presence in a dream forces that dream's outcome into reality, whether he wants it to or not, meaning he has, in a sense, been cursed into being an instrument of fate rather than a participant in his own life. Finn, in that same episode, actually blames the cosmic owl for the end of his relationship with Flame Princess, since the owl's appearances in his dreams seemed to foretell the breakup before it happened, and Finn stops trusting him afterward, treating a cosmic entity's forced role in the structure of destiny as a personal betrayal. It's a small, human, slightly unfair reaction, and the show doesn't correct Finn for having it. The deeper story only comes out in the episode The Bird in the Clock, which reveals that the cosmic owl was once one half of a pair of prankster brothers living at the edge of the cosmos, near the dawn of most things that exist. The two of them, in the show's own account, once ate an ethereal pizza they had been explicitly forbidden to touch. When they were caught, one brother betrayed the other to escape punishment, and the punishment that followed was total and permanent. The accused brother was sent into something called the undergrowth to process the trauma of the betrayal for eternity, becoming an entity known as the karmic worm, while the brother who did the betraying was transformed into the cosmic owl, sentenced to wander through the dreams of mortals for the rest of existence, ensuring premonitions come true, whether he wants them to or not. This is speculation adjacent territory in terms of interpretation, but the plain facts of the myth are stated directly within the show's own narration, so we can treat the broad strokes as canon, even while acknowledging that fans still debate the exact emotional framing of it. What's remarkable is how the show eventually resolves this. In the second season of the spin-off Fiona and Cake, the cosmic owl is killed by the huntress wizard in an act meant to protect a dying Finn from having a fatal premonition dream, and in the process of investigating his death, it comes out that the owl arranged his own killing on purpose. He wanted out. He had been carrying guilt over what he did to his brother for longer than most civilizations have existed, and being murdered was, for him, the only exit available from a job he had never chosen and could never resign from through ordinary means. When his brother, the karmic worm, learns what happened and chooses to resurrect him using one of the very sad memories he processes for a living, the cosmic owl immediately tries to make amends. His brother tells him he forgave him a long time ago, and the cosmic owl, finally free, resolves his own cosmic trial by declaring it a mistrial on the grounds that he engineered his own death and quits. He simply quits being the cosmic owl and flies off, leaving premonition dreams unmade forever after. It is, genuinely, one of the strangest character arcs in the entire franchise. An ancient being defined for over a decade, purely as an omen, turns out to have wanted, more than anything, permission to stop. Prismo, the wish-granting entity who lives in the time room at the center of the multiverse, is close friends with the cosmic owl, and the show quietly implies something even stranger about his own nature, that he himself is the dream projection of a sleeping old man, revealed directly in the episode Wake Up, where Finn and Jake are tasked with retrieving Prismo's actual sleeping body in order to wake him. Prismo is, in essence, someone's dream that gained enough independent structure to run an entire dimension and grant wishes to strangers, and his grief over the cosmic owl's death in the sequel series is treated with real weight. An old man's dream, mourning the death of a bird that was once a boy who betrayed his own brother over a slice of forbidden pizza. And around both of them orbits a whole loose society of similarly strange cosmic middle managers. Party God, a floating wolf's head wearing a backwards baseball cap, whose sole apparent function in the universe is to throw parties and behave badly at them. Death himself, presented as a figure out of the Old West who rules the land of the dead and can, on occasion, be visited by the living, and Grob Gob Glob Grod, the four-headed Martian deity who functions as something close to an actual object of religious worship among the citizens of U, referenced casually by characters swearing, "Oh my glob," the way you or I might invoke any number of familiar exclamations without thinking about their origin. None of these beings behave the way gods behave in most fictional cosmologies. They attend each other's pool parties, they play board games, they get bored, and that mundanity is, itself, the joke and the point. Simultaneously, the universe, in Adventure Time, is not run by anything grander or more dignified than a slightly dysfunctional office full of very old, very tired coworkers who happen to hold power over life, death, and fate. There are two more members of this cosmic office worth lingering on, because they represent opposite ends of what it might mean to hold real power in this universe and simply not care very much about wielding it responsibly. Death, first depicted, as we've mentioned, in the visual language of an Old West gunslinger rather than any traditional reaper, ruling over the land of the dead from something resembling a frontier saloon rather than a throne room. He is, according to the loose religious framework fans and the show's own supplementary material have pieced together over the years, genuinely indifferent to the moral content of a life once that life ends up in front of him. He does not punish the wicked or reward the righteous in any way that maps cleanly onto human ideas of justice. He simply administers the machinery of the afterlife, sorts the dead into their appropriate worlds, and gets on with it, which is either deeply comforting or deeply unsettling, depending on how badly you needed the universe to be fair. And then there's Party God, who might be the single least dignified being with genuine cosmic tier power in the entire mythology, a floating wolf's head in a backwards baseball cap, whose sole apparent purpose in existing is throwing parties and behaving badly at them. He is, by the show's own internal logic, remarkably difficult to actually harm. He can dodge nearly any attack he sees coming, splitting himself into dozens of smaller versions of himself to avoid a blow, or firing a beam from his own mouth to counter a threat before it lands. His one demonstrated weakness, discovered almost by accident, is that his evasive power only works against things he can see coming, which meant that when the Ice King once froze a cloud directly above his head, rather than attacking him head-on, Party God had no defense prepared for it at all, and went down instantly, fainting from a threat he never saw arrive. It's a strange, almost throwaway piece of lore, and it says something quietly true about this entire pantheon of cosmic beings. However much power they hold, however untouchable they seem from any angle they're bothering to watch, none of them have ever built a defense against the direction they're not looking in. Sitting above and around all of them, mostly unexplained, is Hunson Abadir, Marceline's father, ruler of the Nightosphere, a dimension explicitly associated with darkness, corruption, and the consumption of souls. He is treated for most of the show's run as simply a demon lord, comic in his self-absorption, tragic in his failures as a father, but firmly slotted into the category of powerful being with a defined domain, the same way Death has his realm and Prismo has his time room. And then, almost as an aside, in the companion material that expands the show's mythology beyond the episodes themselves, Hunson Abadir says something that quietly recategorizes him entirely, that he does not remember his own origins, because he existed before time itself began, back when the only things that existed at all were entities like Orgalorg and the Lich, the same primordial monsters. The Lich references in his own speech about what existed before the universe had a name for anything. This is never confirmed directly within an aired episode, so it sits closer to strongly implied lore than fully settled canon, and it's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than presenting it as flatly proven. But if it's true even in outline, it means the demon currently running a somewhat petty, mismanaged underworld bureaucracy, more preoccupied with playing golf and being annoyed at his daughter's visits than with any grand cosmic ambition, might actually be one of the oldest entities in the entire multiverse, something that existed before the universe had form, now spending what remains of its unfathomably long existence being irritated that Marceline dropped by without calling first. There is something almost comforting in that too. Even the things older than time in this particular universe eventually settle into something small enough to complain about their kids. Which brings us, naturally, to the man who lost his wife on a mountain and became, in the process, one of the show's most quietly devastating background characters, despite spending most of his screen time being a genuine jerk. Magic Man, later King Man, later Normal Man, depending on which point in his arc you catch him at, is introduced early in the show as exactly what his early episodes present him to be: a chaotic, gleefully cruel Martian who turns innocent bystanders into mutated freaks purely to teach them, in his own words, that he's a jerk. It plays, for a long time, as a fairly simple comic device. Then the show quietly starts dropping in the reasons why. Magic Man lived, once, an ordinary and even happy life on Mars with his wife, Margles, and his brother, the four-headed deity, Grob Gob Glob Grod. He was already a renowned practitioner of magic at the time, respected rather than feared. And then Golb, the same entity of pure chaos who would eventually threaten the entirety of Oo in the series finale, attacked Mars, and among the many Martians it took was Margles. Magic Man spent an unspecified, but clearly enormous stretch of time afterward, searching for any way to bring her back, going so far as to reach Prismo himself and attempt to wish her back into existence. It didn't work. Some things, even in a universe with wish-granting cosmic entities, cannot simply be undone. Eventually, Magic Man built a planetary defense system shaped in his wife's image and named it, in a piece of grief so specific it borders on unbearable, Margles, the magical automated resistance generating laser energy supplier. A machine built to look like the woman he lost, designed to protect the planet from the same kind of attack that took her, as though he could retroactively armor the past by fortifying the future. His own brothers were unsettled by how closely the machine resembled Margles, worried that his grief was compromising the very magic meant to power it. They were right to worry. It's after this loss, and seemingly only after it, that Magic Man's behavior curdles into the cruelty audiences meet first turned into a Martian who was, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, the ceremonial king of Mars at the time, real cool before that night on Olympus Mons, the tallest known mountain in the entire solar system, where Margles died. Everything that happens to him afterward reads differently once you know that. His banishment to Earth for 200 years, ostensibly a punishment for his cruelty, becomes something closer to an exile of someone the universe didn't quite know how to help. His eventual reformation into normal man, brought about not through force but through the patient efforts of Finn and Jake, reads less like a villain being defeated and more like a grieving person slowly being coaxed back into functioning. And when Betty Groff, Simon Petrikov's fiancée, who traveled forward 1,000 years through time, specifically to save the man she loved from the Ice King's crown, eventually absorbs Magic Man's powers for herself in the episode You Forgot Your Floaties. Intending to use that magic to cure Simon, the show quietly links two grief stories that otherwise never would have touched. A man who lost his wife to chaos, and a woman fighting to save a man lost to madness, connected by a single hat passed between them, one grief's leftover power fueling another grief's last attempt at rescue. Betty's transformation costs her deeply the hat, once transferred, brings with it not just Magic Man's magic, but a portion of his accumulated madness and sadness as well, earning her the nickname Magic Ma'am among those who witness what she becomes. She retains her memory in a way Simon never did under the crown's influence, but she loses her stability, drifting into her own kind of madness even as she works desperately to end his. It all comes back together, finally, in the series finale, when Betty and Magic Man are shown together, riding a magic carpet, chanting an incantation, both of them attempting separately, for their own separate losses, to summon Gob, the very entity that took Margles from Magic Man in the first place, hoping to harness its raw, chaotic power for their own private acts of restoration. It goes about as badly as summoning the embodiment of chaos itself tends to go. But the detail worth sitting with is this. Two of the show's most consequential acts of destruction, the summoning that nearly unmakes the entire land of U, are motivated not by malice, but by grief. By two people who loved someone, lost them to something incomprehensibly large, and decided independently that the only remaining option left to them was to bargain with the very force that had taken everything from them in the first place. Magic Man ends his story back in his office on Mars, now called simply King Man, with a photograph of himself and Margles placed quietly on his desk. Not healed, not resolved, just present, still there, still looking at her picture after everything. That is not a small ending for a character who spent his first several appearances turning strangers into feet for the fun of it. Go ahead and let that settle for a moment before we move further out, because the next layer takes us into the forest itself, and into a character whose backstory is somehow even more understated than everything we've covered so far. It's a strange thing, sitting with a character this loud and this played for laughs for years, and only later discovering that his loudest, funniest scenes were built on top of a grief he never got the chance to properly finish. That, more than almost anything else we've covered so far tonight, might be the clearest single lesson buried in this show's obscure corners. That comic relief and genuine devastation were never actually opposites here, just two different volumes of the exact same feeling. Huntress Wizard, when she first appears, reads as almost entirely mysterious, a nature-based archer and wizard who competes in the wizard battle, flirts occasionally with Finn, and generally exists at the edges of the show's frame rather than its center. Her origin, when the show finally gets around to sketching it in, is genuinely tender in a way that most viewers miss because it's delivered so lightly. She was, once, a young plant creature, found and taken in by a huntsman and his wife, who wanted a child of their own. It was through them that she learned to behave in ways closer to human than to plant, developing an appreciation for eggs, learning to eat food with her mouth rather than absorbing nutrients directly from the world around her, the way her original nature might have allowed. And then, according to the show's own timeline material, both of her adoptive parents died in a house fire. The show never lingers on this. It's stated, essentially, in passing, buried in supplementary timeline information rather than dramatized on screen, and yet it recontextualizes her entire adult character. A woman defined by self sufficiency, by an inability to be honest about her own feelings, by a tendency to withdraw rather than ask for help, who was once a small creature raised gently by two people who then vanished from her life through fire. Of all things, the same fire that so many of the show's other losses trace back to in one form or another. This becomes genuinely significant much later in the second season of Fiona and Cake, a piece of the franchise recent enough that most casual viewers of the original series haven't encountered it yet, which makes it some of the most legitimately obscure material available in the entire mythology at the time of this recording. When Finn is dying from injuries sustained years earlier, Huntress Wizard undertakes a genuinely enormous sacrifice to save him. She calls upon every alternate version of herself, scattered across the multiverse, sacrificing their combined life force to heal his body, an act that causes her to ascend and become something called the New Heart of the Forest, a life-giving cosmic force tied directly to Oo's continued magical vitality. It is, structurally, one of the largest sacrifices any character in the show's history has made for another person, and it happens in material still unfolding as of this recording, which means some of the fullest consequences of it are, by necessity, still speculative. We know the broad shape of what happens based on the most recent episodes available, but the longer-term implications for her character and for the heart of the forest going forward had not yet been fully explored at the time this was written. So treat anything beyond the confirmed plot beats as an open question rather than settled fact. What is confirmed, and confirmed in genuinely unsettling detail, is what that same stretch of episodes reveals about how Jake actually died. For years, viewers assumed reasonably, given the tone the original finale struck, that Jake passed peacefully, of old age, sometime after the events of Come Along With Me. The show's evidence for this being nothing more than a tattoo on Finn's chest and a somber tone in the distant future specials. Fiona and Cake complicates that assumption directly. In the episode The Worm and His Orchard, Fiona encounters a place called the Undergrowth, a realm connected to green magic and grief, where a character named the Karmic Worm, yes, the Cosmic Owl's long-lost brother, still processing his own trauma after all those eons, literally consumes unprocessed pain in the form of glowing orbs, breaking it down and returning it upward as healed memory. Among the orbs tied to Finn is the largest, most overloaded one in the entire orchard, and when Fiona brushes against it, she glimpses a fragment of memory. Finn, screaming Jake's name in what can only be described as horror, not the quiet sorrow of a natural passing, but something closer to trauma, something violent or sudden. Fern, who has taken up residence in the undergrowth after his own death and ascension into a kind of grass-based afterlife itself, a wild piece of lore we'll return to, physically pulls Fiona away from the memory and tells her directly that she does not want to see the rest of it. We do not, as of the most recent material available, know exactly what happened to Jake. That is not something I can tell you with confidence, because the show itself has chosen, so far, to withhold it, and it would be irresponsible to speculate further than the show has confirmed. So let's be honest about where the boundary of verified information actually sits. What's confirmed is that the show has deliberately reopened a death it once let audiences assume was gentle, and reframed it as something Finn has spent years actively avoiding processing, throwing himself into increasingly dangerous, borderline self destructive adventures rather than sit with what actually happened to his best friend. That alone is a heavier piece of storytelling than most shows attempt with a character already 10 years gone from the narrative, and it recasts everything we thought we understood about how gently this particular story had chosen to let one of its most beloved characters go. Fern's fate, since we've mentioned him twice now, deserves its own moment because it is one of the more genuinely strange afterlives the show has ever depicted. Fern began as a kind of doppelganger, a being formed from the fusion of a magical grass sword and the severed remains of Finn's own arm, given shape and consciousness by a malevolent force the show calls the Grass Demon, who used Fern's confused, borrowed identity as a weapon against Finn and the people Finn loved. He dies in the series finale, Come Along With Me, seemingly for good, a sad, complicated end for a character who was never quite given the chance to be anyone except an imitation of someone else. And then, in Fiona and Cake, we learn that his consciousness didn't simply end because of his deep connection to green magic and to the same curse that shaped his brief life. Fern's essence ascended into the undergrowth after death, where he found something that reads, genuinely, as peaceful ownership of an identity separate from Finn for what might be the first time in his existence, tending to the realm's flora, specifically guarding and caring for the very tree that holds Finn's unprocessed pain. There's something almost unbearably fitting about that. A character whose entire tragedy was being a copy of someone else, forced by death and cosmic accident into an afterlife where his one job is protecting the original from the weight of what the original refuses to feel. He is, in the most literal sense the show has ever offered, someone who died as an imitation and was reborn as a caretaker. Before we go there, though, there's a detail hiding inside Jake's own body that most people never think to question, because the show spent years treating it as a joke rather than a mystery. Jake can stretch. Jake can flatten himself into a car, harden his fist into a pickaxe, grow enormous or shrink small enough to fit in Finn's pocket, and for most of the show's run, nobody, not the characters, not the audience, seriously asks why. It reads, for a long time, as simply a fun visual gimmick, the kind of thing a cartoon dog is allowed to do without needing a scientific footnote. Princess Bubblegum herself states plainly in the episode Wizards Only, Fools, that Jake's powers are not magical, which quietly closes off the most obvious explanation a world full of wizards and elementals would otherwise offer. And then, years later, in an episode called Joshua and Margaret Investigations, the show finally answers the question nobody thought to keep asking, and the answer turns out to be one of the stranger and more uncomfortable pieces of biology in the entire mythology. Jake's stretching ability is hereditary. It came from his biological father, not Joshua the dog, the loving, magical, slightly eccentric father who actually raised him, but a shape-shifting, extra-dimensional being named Warren Ampersand, who arrived in the land of Oo from another world entirely, touched several citizens of Oo on the shoulder in ways that unsettled them, and eventually bit Joshua on the head. That bite is not incidental. It is, in the show's own biological logic, the actual mechanism of Jake's conception. Warren's alien physiology merged with Joshua's own, causing Joshua to fall ill and eventually give birth to Jake directly out of a boil that formed on his head. Margaret, Jake's adoptive mother in every practical sense, gave birth to Jermaine around the same period through more conventional means. and the two puppies were raised as brothers with no indication for most of their lives that they came from such different origins. The show does not shy away from how deeply unsettling this actually is once you look at it directly. Warren Ampersand did not simply pass on a trait out of paternal generosity. He is revealed much later to have fathered a great many offspring across many worlds over what is clearly an extremely long life, using each of them the same way, waiting until they matured, then draining their accumulated youth and life force back into himself in order to extend his own existence indefinitely, discarding the emptied husk of each child once the harvest was complete. When Jake finally meets him properly as an adult, in the episode Jake the Star Child, Warren presents himself warmly, even sentimentally, showing Jake a museum built in his own honor and claiming he's been watching over him for years out of genuine affection. It is, at least partly, a performance. Warren gives Jake a matching belt, seemingly as a gift, and only once Jake begins losing his own youth and vitality, visibly aging, while Warren grows younger and stronger in front of him, does the actual function of the belts become clear. Jake tricks his own father into an embrace, specifically in order to switch the belts back, reclaiming the life that was being siphoned out of him. And when Warren, defeated, learns that Jake has children of his own, his affection evaporates instantly and completely. He simply reveals his plan to travel to O and do the exact same thing to his own grandchildren. Jake throws him into a black hole to stop him, not metaphorically, an actual black hole, opened through whatever alien mechanism Warren's homeworld operates on, and Warren's final recorded words, delivered with a kind of manic cheer, even as he's being consumed by it, are that he's going 4D, baby, which leaves open, deliberately, the possibility that something of him survived the fall in some form beyond ordinary death. Sit with what that means for the character audiences have spent a decade loving as the show's warmest, laziest, most emotionally uncomplicated presence. Jake's entire biological origin is an act of violation committed against his own adoptive father's body, followed by an entire family line built on the same predatory pattern, repeating itself across generations of unknown numbers of children Jake never met and will likely never know existed, each of them presumably drained and discarded the same way Jake nearly was. And Jake, upon learning all of this, does not become bitter or haunted by it in the way that revelation might reasonably produce in another character. He processes it the way he processes almost everything, with acceptance, with a kind of unbothered equanimity that the show frames elsewhere as one of his defining strengths. He goes home, he stays himself. The horror of his origin simply becomes one more strange fact, layered underneath an identity that was never actually built on it in the first place, because Joshua and Margaret, whatever biology says about where he came from, are the ones who made him who he actually is. It is worth remembering the next time Jake gives Finn one of his loose, half-right pieces of advice. Underneath that easy warmth is a creature who was, quite literally, engineered by his own biological father to eventually be consumed, and who simply decided, once he found out that it didn't have to define him, we should talk before we come back down toward the surface about the fire that never quite got put out, Flame Princess, whose real name the show gives us plainly as Phoebe, and whose childhood is one of the more overtly cruel pieces of backstory Adventure Time ever committed to screen without softening it for comedy. As an infant, Phoebe was chaotic, powerful, and by every account more dangerous even than her own father, the Flame King. Her father's response to that danger was not protection, it was rejection. He ordered a messenger to abandon his own infant daughter in a nearby forest, to let her wander off and, presumably, die there rather than deal with the threat she represented to his rule. She survived. She wandered, laughing, burning the surroundings around her with a kind of feral, undirected joy, until Princess Bubblegum, of all people, already established by this point in the mythology as someone deeply uncomfortable with uncontrolled, unpredictable life, found her, put on a fire-resistant suit, and personally returned the infant to the Fire Kingdom, insisting the Flame King take responsibility for the child he'd tried to discard. What followed was not reconciliation. It was containment. Together, Flame King and Princess Bubblegum decided the safest solution was to seal the infant permanently inside a giant lantern in the main chamber of the Fire Kingdom, where she would remain, isolated, for the next 14 years of her life, growing up with no direct human or elemental contact beyond the voice of a small, sympathetic assistant named Flambeau, who occasionally spoke to her through the glass. 14 years, locked in a lantern, alone, because two separate authority figures, one of them her own father, decided that the danger she represented outweighed any obligation to actually raise or love her. When she finally emerges, introduced to Finn through Jake's well-meaning matchmaking, her volatility, her trust issues, her sudden violent mood swings, read entirely differently once you know the actual shape of what produced them. This isn't a character who is simply intense by nature, the word the show's own promotional material sometimes reaches for. This is a person whose formative years consisted of complete isolation, imposed by the two people who should have protected her, justified by a danger. Neither of them ever gave her the chance to learn to manage on her own terms. Her eventual arc deposing her father, becoming a genuinely thoughtful ruler who actively works to address her citizens' concerns rather than dominate them through fear reads. Once you know all of this, less like a straightforward redemption story and more like an act of quiet, sustained defiance against every assumption anyone in her life ever made about what she was destined to become. She spent 14 years being told, through confinement, that she was too dangerous to be free. She spent her adulthood proving that the people who confined her had simply never bothered to know her. While we're still on the subject of the Candy Kingdom's failed experiments in family, it's worth going back to a creation we mentioned earlier only in passing, because his story turns out to be its own small, self-contained tragedy, and it directly foreshadows something far more disturbing that Princess Bubblegum would attempt years later. The Earl of Lemongrab is introduced as pure comic relief, a shrieking, tyrannical, socially catastrophic ruler installed in a remote castle, memorable mostly for his catchphrases and his complete inability to understand basic human warmth. Princess Bubblegum herself describes him, plainly, as her first attempt at creating a new form of candy life, and the show is honest, in a way it rarely is with its jokes, about what that actually means. Lemongrab is a failure, not a villain in any traditional sense, not evil in the way the show usually codes evil, but constitutionally, permanently unwell, incapable of processing affection without becoming distressed by it. In the episode You Made Me, Princess Bubblegum tries to teach him empathy directly, showing him how to cuddle a candy person named Crunchy in the hope that physical tenderness might teach him something words haven't. Lemongrab cannot tolerate it. He pokes and slaps at Crunchy defensively, screaming, overwhelmed by an intimacy his entire biology was never built to receive, and when Bubblegum tries to explain that his behavior is wrong, Lemongrab answers with a line that lands harder than almost anything else in the episode, that his lemon heart is responsible for his nature and that it must be correct, since she is the one who made him this way. He is, in his own broken logic, simply being faithful to his design. The show's own reference material draws an explicit connection here to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a creation confronting its creator with the plain, unanswerable fact that whatever is wrong with him was put there on purpose by someone who claims to love him and yet built him incapable of receiving that love back. Bubblegum's response to the problem she created is not to comfort him. It's to build him a companion, manufacturing a second lemon grab specifically so the original wouldn't have to be alone with his own malformed nature, a solution that, on the surface, looks like kindness, and underneath, reads like someone managing a mistake rather than actually repairing it. It does not end gently. Years later, the show reveals in the episode Too Old that the original lemon grab has degraded into something close to a genuine tyrant, forcing shock collars onto his own subjects to compel obedience. And in one of the more quietly horrifying images the show ever committed to screen without lingering on it, he is shown to have slowly, methodically eaten more than half of his own companion, Lemon Grab 2, over an unspecified period, eventually consuming him entirely when the second Lemon Grab finally works up the resistance to fight back against the regime the original had built. A creation made to keep another creation company is instead devoured by it. The show moves past this fairly quickly, in the tone it usually reserves for its darkest background details, stated, shown, and left there, without music to tell you how to feel about it. Lemon Grab, though, is only the first attempt, and Princess Bubblegum's second attempt at manufacturing an heir is where the show's uneasiness about her own character reaches its sharpest point. In the episode simply titled Goliad, we learn that Bubblegum, having nearly died and having discovered that no science or magic available to her can extend her own life indefinitely, has created a successor named Goliad, specifically to inherit the throne if anything happens to her, a being designed deliberately to be extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily powerful, with the explicit capacity for psychic mind control built directly into her design. Goliad begins as something genuinely sweet, curious, eager to learn, greeting Finn and Jake with the innocent politeness of a small child taking in the world for the first time. It does not stay that way for long. Watching Jake attempt to discipline a group of unruly children at the Candy Kingdom preschool, Goliad draws her own conclusion about what effective leadership actually requires and reasons her way, with unsettling speed, into a philosophy of pure dominance, that because she is stronger than everyone around her, the well-being of anyone weaker simply does not need to factor into her decisions. She demonstrates this philosophy directly and without hesitation, crushing a bee that has been pollinating a flower simply to prove a point about relative strength, then resurrecting it a moment later, purely to demonstrate that she can undo the harm just as casually as she caused it. Might, in Goliad's stated worldview, does not just make right. Might makes the question of right entirely irrelevant. Bubblegum, watching what she has made, arrives at the same conclusion she reached with Gumbald and would reach again elsewhere. The creation has gone wrong, and the only responsible option left is to take it apart before it can do real damage. Goliad, reading her creator's mind directly, does not wait to be disassembled. She seizes the castle and the entire Candy Kingdom by force, and it takes a second creation, Goliad's own genetic brother, a sphinx named Stormo, built using what Bubblegum specifically calls Finn's heroic DNA, rather than her own, to physically match and contain her. The two of them remain locked, to this day, in what the show describes as an eternal psychic battle fought entirely inside their own minds, their bodies left motionless atop the Candy Kingdom castle for the rest of the series, visible in the background of numerous later episodes as a kind of permanent, unresolved monument to the one experiment Bubblegum could neither fix nor fully undo. A blogger writing an early analysis of the episode for the site Comic Pusher pointed out something the show never states outright, but leaves entirely available to notice. Bubblegum built her failed heir out of her own genetic material and built the being capable of stopping that heir out of someone else's, which means that whatever went wrong inside Goliad may not have been a defect in the recipe at all, but something Bubblegum was passing down directly from herself. That's speculation worth flagging clearly as speculation, since the show never confirms it in so many words. But the pattern sitting underneath it is not speculation at all. It's stated plainly, episode after episode, across nearly a decade. Every single attempt Bubblegum makes to manufacture family, or an heir, or a companion for a lonely creation ends the same way. With betrayal, with consumption, with violence, with something locked away, because it turned out to be more than she could safely keep close. Gumball tried to overthrow her. Lemongrab ate his own companion alive. Goliad seized the throne the moment she was given the chance. Bubblegum keeps building anyway. Generation after generation, this costs him, because the alternative, being alone with the knowledge of what she is capable of creating, seems to frighten her more than the repeated cost of trying again. There's one more piece of the Candy Kingdom's political architecture worth sitting with before we move on, because it's easy to laugh through the episode that introduces it without noticing how quietly bleak the joke actually is underneath. A recurring background character named the King of Ooh, tall, golden, mustached, dressed in the kind of gaudy finery that reads as instantly untrustworthy, discovers, with the help of a mysterious benefactor who turns out to be Orgalorg, wearing Gunter's borrowed body, an actual legal loophole allowing him to call an election challenging Princess Bubblegum's rule directly. Bubblegum, confident that the citizens she personally created will naturally recognize her as the superior leader, barely bothers to campaign. The King of Ooh, by contrast, runs a charming, dishonest, thoroughly modern campaign publicly, performatively apologizing to a sympathetic figure named Sweet Pea for an earlier wrongdoing, accepting a forgiving kiss in front of the crowd, deflecting questions about his own past misconduct with a shrug and a joke about not knowing what he'd done. It works. On election day, with Bubblegum's attention diverted by an approaching catalyst comet, the votes come in, and the King of Ooh wins by a landslide. Bubblegum's reaction to losing is the part the show refuses to let her off the hook for. She doesn't simply lose an election to a more charismatic opponent. She loses it, specifically, because as she herself is forced to recognize, watching her own citizens' blank, cheerful, uncomprehending faces on the night of the results, she engineered every single one of them, generations back, to be too simple-minded to reliably distinguish a good leader from a bad one. This is the same design choice that traces directly back to the night Gumball betrayed her. She built docility into the Candy People, specifically to prevent the kind of uprising her own family attempted 800 years earlier. And the unintended cost of that decision is a population that can be talked out of the leader who has spent centuries actually working in their interest by a charming stranger who does none of the actual labor of ruling and simply knows how to apologize in public. One commentator, writing for the blog Gunterfan1992, pointed out that this isn't really a story about democracy failing so much as it is a story about the specific, engineered ignorance that Bubblegum herself planted generations earlier, finally coming home to collect its debt. What follows the King of Oo's ascension is, briefly, chaos, the Candy Kingdom, descending into disorganized panic under his rule almost immediately, mirroring an earlier, smaller scale piece of political commentary the show delivered back in its first season, in an episode called The Silent King, where Finn briefly rules over a tribe of goblins and discovers, to his own frustration, that they don't actually want the gentle, permissive leadership he's inclined to offer. They want to be told what to do, loudly and constantly, and interpret any absence of firm direction as an invitation to riot. Taken together, these two episodes, separated by years of the show's runtime, form a genuinely uncomfortable through line about governance in the land of Oo, that neither an engineered, docile population under a benevolent ruler nor an open, unrestricted democracy actually produces a stable, thriving society, and that every system the show tests eventually reveals the same flaw sitting underneath it. Somebody, somewhere, has to decide how much freedom the people below them can actually be trusted with. And every single character who has ever made that decision, however good their intentions, has eventually gotten it wrong. It's worth noting, too, that the King of Oo's story doesn't end in triumph either. Later episodes show him losing his political standing almost entirely, reduced to scraping by in a slum with his loyal secretary Toronto, still insisting, with the same unearned confidence that won him the crown in the first place, that a comeback is right around the corner. Even the beneficiary of Bubblegum's engineered ignorance eventually discovers that charm alone doesn't sustain a kingdom, and that the same fickle, uninformed public that elevated him overnight can just as easily forget he ever mattered. We're deep enough now, deep past most of what anyone talks about on a casual rewatch, that it's worth pausing to notice something about all of these stories, sitting side by side. Gumbald, betraying the niece who built him out of love, because love wasn't enough to satisfy his ambition. Peppermint Butler, keeping a room in the Candy Kingdom that even its own princess seems unwilling to fully look inside. Billy, dying unremarked and unmourned, his body worn like a costume by the exact evil he spent his life fighting. The Cosmic Owl, carrying guilt across the entire span of the universe's existence for a betrayal committed over a slice of forbidden pizza before most things had names yet. Magic Man, building a machine shaped like his dead wife because he couldn't build anything else that would bring her back. Jake, engineered by his own biological father to eventually be drained and discarded, choosing to simply stay who he already was instead of letting that fact rewrite him. Huntress Wizard, raised gently and then orphaned by fire, growing into someone who cannot say what she feels out loud. Flame Princess, locked in glass for 14 years by the people who should have loved her enough to try something else. Lemongrab, screaming at the touch of the very affection his creator tried to give him, and Goliad, deciding within days of being born that kindness was simply a weakness she didn't need to carry. Every single one of these stories is, at its foundation, about a specific kind of aloneness, not the show's more famous, more frequently discussed loneliness, the Ice King rattling around his empty palace, but something quieter and more structural. These are characters whose isolation was, in almost every case, built by someone else's hand or by a system that never asked their permission before it shaped them. Gumbald's exile from real belonging was self inflicted, and Goliad's was arguably a design flaw passed down rather than chosen. Everyone else on this list was isolated by circumstance, by grief, by fear, by a decision made above their heads that they had no say in the way the candy people were built, too simple to protect their own kingdom, the way a whole tribe of mutated humans learned to survive underground by becoming something the surface world could no longer recognize as kin, and the show rarely announces any of this as a theme. It just keeps building characters this way, quietly, across a decade, trusting that if you go looking in enough corners, the pattern finds you on its own, the same way the ruins in the background of every sunny outdoor scene find you eventually too. Once you've watched enough episodes to finally know where to let your eyes drift, there's one more layer worth going down into before we come back up for air, and it concerns the actual bureaucracy of death itself, because Adventure Time built out an afterlife with rules, hierarchy, and this is the detail that tends to surprise people most: actual political instability. The land of the dead in this show is not a single place. It's structured as a set of numbered dead worlds, at least 50 of them by the time the later material gets around to counting, with the first dead world reserved for what the show implies are the worst people who ever lived, and the higher numbered worlds representing progressively more peaceful, more enlightened states of the afterlife, with the 50th described as a place of genuine, quiet peace. Death himself rules over this entire structure, depicted, notably, as a figure straight out of the Old West, rather than the traditional hooded reaper, a small but telling choice that keeps the show's cosmology from ever feeling too solemn, even when the stakes involved are enormous. In the special Together Again, which follows Finn's own natural death and his journey into this same afterlife to be reunited with Jake, we learn that this hierarchy is not stable, and that death, even for death, is a job that can be lost. A character called New Death, influenced by something the material refers to as the Lich Hand, kills the original Death and takes over rule of the dead worlds, motivated by a desire to eliminate the higher dead worlds entirely on the theory that true peace represents some kind of failure of the system he's inherited. Finn's reunion with Jake becomes, unwittingly, the very mechanism New Death needed to finally access and destroy the 50th dead world, the most peaceful one of all, collapsing everyone who lived there back down into the first, worst dead world, along with everybody else. It's a genuinely upsetting piece of cosmology to sit with that even the reward at the very end of a well-lived life, the quiet, enlightened peace waiting in the highest dead world, is not guaranteed to be permanent, that it can be destroyed by administrative turnover in a bureaucracy none of the dead have any say in. Life herself, yes, an actual character named Life, functioning as something like a cosmic counterpart to death, is outraged at what her own son, New Death, has done, and gives Finn what the show calls the kiss of life to use as a weapon against him, a detail that treats the balance between life and death not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as an active, ongoing family conflict between beings old enough to have been fighting about it since before recorded history began. None of this made it into any of the show's marketing. None of it gets discussed nearly as often as the Ice King's tragedy or Marceline's 1,000 years, because it lives almost entirely in a single hour-long special released years after the main series ended Watched by a fraction of the audience the flagship show commanded. And yet, it might be one of the most quietly radical things Adventure Time ever proposed. That even the structure of the afterlife, the place every single character in this story is eventually headed, is not fixed, not fair, and not immune to the same kind of quiet institutional cruelty that shapes so much of what happens while everyone is still alive. There's one more grief worth surfacing before we come all the way back to shore, and it belongs to Marceline, though it's a different corner of her history than the one most people already know. Her relationship with Simon and her 1,000 years of survival get discussed constantly, and rightly so. Her mother, Elise, gets discussed almost never, because her story lives almost entirely inside a single special, Obsidian, released years after the flagship series ended, and even attentive fans of the original run can go their whole time with this show without encountering it directly. The broad strokes of the special concern a magma dragon named Molto Larvo, once subdued by a younger Marceline using nothing but a punk anthem and sheer defiant volume, now awakening again generations later inside the Glass Kingdom, a fragile, brittle society whose citizens all secretly carry cracks they spend enormous social energy pretending not to have. But the emotional engine of the episode runs on something quieter, tucked into flashback. The final days Marceline spent with her mother in the wasteland in the years just after the Mushroom War, before Simon Petrikov ever found her wandering alone. Elise, it turns out, was dying. Some kind of illness. The show is not overly specific about its exact nature, leaving the particulars somewhat speculative, though the visual language strongly implies something like a slow, wasting sickness was killing her, and rather than tell her young daughter the truth, Elise chose to hide it entirely, protecting Marceline from the knowledge the same way, decades later, Simon would try to protect her by leaving before the crown finished consuming him. Elise's final act, in the flashback the show gives us, involves using her own demonic powers to save Marceline from a mutated wolf, and rather than let her daughter watch what that act of protection actually cost her, she disappears, rather than die in front of her. For the entirety of the 1,000 years that followed, Marceline believed her mother had simply abandoned her, left her, chosen, of her own free will, to walk away from a small, frightened child alone in the wreckage of a destroyed world, for reasons Marceline could never quite piece together, and eventually stopped trying to. That belief calcified into something closer to a worldview, that when people leave you, it's because some part of you drove them to it. That abandonment is simply what happens to her, over and over, regardless of who's doing the leaving. Simon's departure only confirmed what she already believed to be true about herself. It's only an Obsidian, returning to the exact place in the wasteland where she was hurt worst, that Marceline finally finds a message her mother left behind and learns the actual truth, that Elise didn't leave because she wanted to. She left in her own broken, protective, imperfect logic because she was dying and couldn't bear to let her daughter watch it happen. My mom and I didn't talk about bad stuff, Marceline says, once she understands. When she got really sick, she didn't even tell me. She meant well, but I think it messed me up about being honest about my feelings. It's a small, plain, devastating piece of self-diagnosis delivered without any music underneath it to soften the landing, and it recontextualizes something about Marceline that the main series never quite explained. Why a woman who has survived 1,000 years of loss still finds it almost impossible to simply say out loud to the people she loves that she is hurting. What makes this land with the weight it does is how directly it rhymes with everything else this world has already taught her. Her mother left to protect her from watching a death. Simon left to protect her from a man who was disappearing. Two of the most important people in Marceline's entire existence chose absence as an act of love, and the show is honest enough to let that pattern sit there, unresolved, rather than pretending that understanding the reason behind an abandonment automatically undoes the damage the abandonment itself already did. Marceline doesn't emerge from obsidian fixed. She emerges from it with one more piece of the actual truth, which the show suggests, gently, might be the only kind of healing actually available to someone who has been alive long enough to accumulate this much unprocessed grief. Not a cure, just a slightly more complete and honest picture of exactly what happened to her, and permission, finally, to stop believing the worst possible version of every story simply because the worst version was the only one she had. So here is where all of this obscure material actually leaves us. Once you step back from each individual thread and look at the whole shape they make together. Adventure Time's most famous story, the one everybody already knows by heart, is about a grief that grew a candy-colored world on top of itself and somehow stayed beautiful anyway. But underneath that story, in the corners almost nobody bothers to walk into, is a second, quieter argument the show makes across 10 years and several spin-offs without ever stating it directly, that almost every character who ever mattered in this world was shaped at some formative point by an isolation someone else built for them, whether out of malice, fear, grief, or a bureaucratic decision made somewhere far above their heads. Bonnibel built a family and then built an entire kingdom's social structure around never trusting family again. Peppermint Butler carries a darkness the kingdom depends on and refuses to examine. Billy died alone and was worn like a mask. The Cosmic Owl carried a betrayal across the entire lifespan of the universe. Magic Man built a machine in the shape of a woman he couldn't get back. Huntress Wizard learned to love from two people fire eventually took from her. Flame Princess spent 14 years behind glass because the people responsible for her were more afraid of her than curious about her. And even death itself, the show suggests, is not a stable resting place, but a system that can be seized, altered, and made cruel by whoever happens to be running it at the time. None of this cancels out the warmth the main story is famous for. It sits alongside it, the way the ruins sit alongside the candy forests in nearly every outdoor scene of this show. Visible if you know to look, never quite disappearing, never quite the whole picture either. That, more than any single reveal we've covered tonight, might be the most honest thing Adventure Time ever built. A world where the darkness and the tenderness were never actually in competition with each other. They were always just neighbors, sharing the same soil, growing out of the same 800 years of aftermath, waiting for someone patient enough to go looking in the corners and see both of them at once. There's a particular kind of trust required to build a show this way, and it's worth naming directly before we let this one go for the night. Most children's television, even the good kind, tends to resolve its darkness within the runtime of a single episode. The monster is defeated, the lesson is learned, the credits roll over something settled. Adventure Time almost never does that with the material we've spent tonight in. Gumbald's betrayal sits unresolved for 6 seasons before anyone bothers to explain it. Billy dies off camera and stays dead, with no tribute episode, no eulogy, nothing but a quiet confirmation delivered secondhand through another character's dialogue 2 seasons later. The Cosmic Owl's entire tragedy waits the better part of a decade to surface, and even then arrives inside a spin-off most of the audience for the original show will never watch. Peppermint Butler's darkness is never fully explained at all, not once, across the entire run of the franchise as it currently stands. This isn't negligence. It's a specific kind of narrative patience that trusts the audience to keep carrying a question without an answer for years at a time, the same way a person carries an unresolved grief of their own, not because they've decided to stop looking for the answer, but because some answers only arrive once you've lived long enough alongside the question to be ready for them. That patience is, in its own way, the most obscure piece of lore in the entire show, because it isn't a fact you can look up on a wiki or confirm with a timestamp. It's a structural choice, repeated so many times across so many different characters and so many different seasons that it stops being a coincidence and starts being something closer to a philosophy. That the corners of a story matter exactly as much as its center, that a world only feels lived in once you've noticed. It keeps secrets even from the people who love it, and that the kindest thing a storyteller can do sometimes is simply wait, trusting that the right viewer, at the right hour, in the right kind of quiet, will eventually go looking for what's sitting just past the edge of the frame and will find something worth having stayed up for. If tonight took you somewhere you didn't expect the land of Ooh to go, that's kind of the whole point of this channel, going past the parts everyone already knows and sitting in the rooms most people walk straight past, the ones that don't get chapter titles or trailers or highlight reels, just a quiet accumulation of detail waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. If you'd like more of that, more nights like this one, subscribing costs nothing and it genuinely helps this find the people who'd want to hear it, and a like on your way out tells me which corners of this world you want me to keep digging into next. Thank you for spending this much time in the dark with me tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from, whatever time it happens to be where you are. Rest well. The land of Ooh isn't going anywhere, and neither, it turns out, are any of the rooms we haven't opened yet. They'll still be sitting there quietly the next time either of us is ready to go looking.